Thanks so much for joining us. I appreciate that in the United States it's into your evening time, and into Europe it's, if you are joining from Europe, I'm not sure if anyone is, but it's quite early in the morning there. We'll wait maybe another 30 seconds if people are joining across. I know there's a number of people coming in from Australia and other parts of Southeast Asia, but nice to meet you, Max and Courtney from DC and Michigan. We will be using the chat box throughout, so if there's anything that comes up as Leonie and I are presenting, please drop questions or comments in there. We've framed our session to be about 30 minutes, and then hopefully about 10 to 12 minutes of talanoa and conversation afterwards. Cool. Excellent. All right, we'll make a start, and as other people join in, obviously be able to see the recording as well. But tēnā tātou katoa, ko Nabukalevu te monga, ko Drekenekelo te awa, ko Otapoti te unga, ko Blandel te waka, ko Kong te hapu, ko Ngāti Whiti te iwi, ke te noho o ke whanganui atara, ko te modi Kong tōku ingoa, nō reira tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Just in translating that little bit of reo there, I'm just acknowledging my mountain, my river, Drekenekelo, and Nabukalevu, which are both from my father's island in Kandavu of Fiji, my family and tribe, also of Fiji, where I am, Whanganui Atara, which is Wellington, and that my name is Tim Kong. Also just want to acknowledge Te Aotearoa, the iwi, who are holders of the land, holders and stewards of the land in which Wellington is, where I am based today. Kia ora and nice to meet you all. Leonie, do you want to introduce? Oh my God.
Patalo fatu I lepe ia male mamalo le aso. Malole sofua maua male langi mama. My name is Leonie Samutui. I am currently based in Tamaki, Makaurau. It's the afternoon here. It's a little bit of definitely a privilege to be here speaking to you all today, even though I can't see all of you, but just to acknowledge the mana whenua on which the land of Auckland Museum stands. It's Ngāti Whatua ki Orake, Ngāti Paua, and Tainui. So coming to you from Auckland, and very privileged to be here. Tim?
Thank you, Leonie. I'll just share my screen and we'll get the slides up and running here. Okay, here we go. Sorry, just resize my windows here so I know where I am. So thank you for joining us today. Our topic today is digitalpacific.org, which is a project that Leonie and I have been working on since about January of 2020. This project is funded by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Australia. It's technically known as the Pacific Virtual Museum Pilot, which is, I think, in part why I got invited to come and speak. But as we walk through, you see it's quite a different concept and construct from a traditional museum. The project is funded, as said, by the Australian government. That would be my dog, apologies. And is funded by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Australia, and is implemented or being delivered by the National Library of New Zealand, where I'm based, in partnership with the National Library of Australia. When we say Pacific, we define it as, broadly speaking, the areas of Polynesia, Micronesia, and Melanesia. So it excludes, for example, the Philippines, Japan, and the western coastlines of North and South and Central America. I suppose one of the things to set right at the start, because it is funded by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, this is a foreign aid funded package. And if you understand or are aware of any of the great geopolitics of foreign aid funding, that comes with a number of constraints and boundaries, I suppose. So we'll just set that in play at the start. Our main aim with this project was to make visible and accessible the digitized cultural heritage of the people in the Pacific and of the Pacific. And to do this, we've sort of lent into a number of things. And the first one is that we use a metaphor, and the metaphor being of a bridge between worlds. And in doing so in a digital way, we want our site to serve as a bridge. And it's a bridge between the worlds of museums, galleries, libraries, and archives, our content partners, and the worlds of Pacific peoples. The GLAM sector, in particular those based in the former and existing colonial powers, hold tens of thousands of items, objects, and records from Pacific locations. And most Pacific people are unaware that your institutions, these institutions, hold these items and records. So as a bridge, we become an access point, a starting point, which quickly allows Pacific people, either based in the Pacific or living around the world, to access your content, the content of the content from our partners, and to explore it on their sites. I think one of the things in terms of being a metaphor that helps people understand what we do is, as a bridge, we can't be sticky. We don't want people to stay on our site. We want people to come to our site and use it, but we want people to quickly get to your site. And I think that's a really interesting challenge from a digital design point of view, because most digital design is predicated on keeping users on your site. You want them to come to your site and stay there. And we don't want that. We want them to use your site as quickly as possible. So we want the site and our project to be digital, but we also want to be a bridge between these two worlds. We also built this project digitally for the realities of the Pacific. And we designed with digital constraints in mind and right at front of mind, actually. We designed for a number of things. Firstly, low bandwidth and high cost mobile networks. As you can see in this tweet, there's a lot of challenges to getting connected in the Pacific. We've designed the site to function as well as possible on 2G and 3G environments, and also in places where data is expensive. And to do this, we actually, one of the constraints we put on ourselves is that we aim for no page on the site to be any bigger than 800 kilobytes in size. And that includes images. As of this morning, the homepage is about 870, and the default view for all search results is about 425. So we work really hard at that. Blog posts are my responsibility, and so I'm constantly aware of how I can scale and resize images to keep that page weight down. Secondly, we designed for mobile first, and what that means is we didn't design for desktop browsers. In fact, as the product owner, I actually backlogged and stopped bug fixes for desktop browsers in the interests of maximizing our developer time and spend. Also in that mobile first design, we focus on design elements that function to make the key parts of metadata visible and accessible. And that means we don't embed anything. There's no audio or video playback on our site. We always land you on where you hold the content, or where our content partners hold that audio and video content. There are multiple languages across the Pacific, obviously, so that meant designing a interface that needed to be icon first and quite uncluttered, with a focus on less reading. One of our user testers said to us, "I really like that because my grandma, she can speak English, but she can't read it." And so, this site actually works for her in terms of navigation. Visually, from the site, we wanted the site to reflect something of the Pacific back to the users, and to help center a Pacific narrative or a Pacific framing of all of these records and cultural heritage items. In my early conversations with our designer, I said, whilst we think of it as a search engine, because that was our starting point, I said, let's not make it a blank white page that you land on, unlike another search engine that some of you might be aware of. Let's make it look like something of the Pacific. And so the color palette and the design SVGs are all part of that. There are so many languages across the Pacific. Papua New Guinea alone has 800. So we couldn't capture and use all of them, but we use Contentful as our backend to allow us to quickly edit the header components and specific pages to reflect languages. For example, this week in Aotearoa, it's Fiji Language Week, and so the header text on our site is in Fijian. Lastly, our homepage design was to make it easy to find stuff as a Pacific person. Often our mental models of this blue continent is it's just all ocean. But if you're from Chuuk or from the Marquesas or from Vanuatu or Nomia, these islands, these really unique islands, and these coastlines are your home. And so the location page that we've built on the front page, or the location section, sorry, the designs and the silhouettes are designed to enable a person from each of these islands to recognize or possibly discover that shape, that place, which is their home, to select it and then see records in some way labeled or tagged with that location. It was actually Leonie, who's presenting with me today, that captured this approach really early on with the line, "I'm Samoan, show me the Samoan stuff," as we're looking across these tens of thousands of records. It was digital using agile, and I think this is a really interesting one because in the tech space, agile is default and a way of thinking, and there's a language and a rhythm around it. But I had a pretty rough knowledge of agile, and it's fair to say it's still pretty rough. But we've been wonderfully supported by our vendors in developing this, and I think also agile is not a default for large parts of public service within which we sit as the National Library. And it's also not a default for a Pacific way of engaging and thinking through processes. And so we had a challenge of melding these two different worlds. This was never a tech project for us. It was a people project. And we had to work really deliberately, again, all online because of the pandemic, to build relationships to help people understand the language that we were using and to be aware of the conversations and the specific language to help us work together in an agile way. The foundations of the site, as you look at it, which is Supplejack, which is our main backend, the schema, the API, and all of that, was established in April of 2020, and our first initial build period and the majority of what you see on the site now was developed over about 20 weeks of build time. We were ready to launch in about August, September of last year. We didn't build an MVP, a minimum viable product, to test ideas. We just treated the whole thing as an MVP and continued to iterate with it as we went through. We're not constantly building in sprints. In terms of our budget, we pause work to work with our co-design group, which I'll mention in our next point. And so it's not constant, but it reflects what we're able to do at a point in time. We explored some ideas that didn't go any further, some natural language processing and some other aspects like that. But this work was all time boxed and held really tight, so that was never a risk to the budget or to our time constraints. We have budgeted for ongoing monthly maintenance in between sort of funded development sprints, but that has been a really reliable process that allows us to keep the site well maintained and to fix anything as it comes through. Our co-design group also met during that period with us once a week in that first initial phase, and now meets with us fortnightly. And that co-design group, and I appreciate co-design is an often used word, and as a concept, it means many things to many people. So my reflections here in this piece are to reflect what we've done as a project. Our aim with this project in a Pacific way was to include as many voices of those in the Pacific to understand how our pilot project could or should be of use to them. And of course, in January 2020, as I said, we started and we were hoping to travel to a large number of these islands to build relationships and to understand how to build a thing. But as you will all know, a global pandemic rolled in and we had to shift everything, as everyone did, to fully online and fully remote. So the tools, which many of you will have used over the last 18 months, Zoom, email, Slack, recordings, we were working across eight or nine different time zones as well. All of this work and conversation included our developers, who we only met once before we went into our level 4 lockdown here in New Zealand in March of last year. Our ongoing process for the pilot is to stay open to bringing on board people and conversations and honor people who speak to Pacific cultural heritage. And having those individuals and community groups or institutions be part of our conversation is very much an ongoing part of this project. I have to say, and Leonie will touch on this a wee bit, I don't think we've been as successful as we could have been in this co-design approach. It has been informed by a co-design group, but by definition, those people, the only people that could attend via online methods were privileging those that had stable network connections, that had jobs or roles to allow them to join us in our conversations. So we need to continue to seek out and foster these relationships right across the Pacific. This point is around digital as metadata. We're not a repository. We don't curate our records. We're a very small team of 3 people. And I suppose like DPLA or like Europeana or Trove, we leverage metadata from our content partners, as I've described. We rely on the authority and due diligence of the content partners, and we honor that. We always aim to work equitably to share and show that metadata. We only ever show publicly accessible digitized records and also share the respective copyright conditions that is on that metadata. Our harvests are recurring, so that when metadata on a content partner's site is updated, we reflect those changes on our next harvest. We're not into translation of metadata for the sake of it, or for an English-speaking audience. We obviously only need to match the fields in our schema, so to ensure that the front end functions properly. But we do welcome metadata in any language. If content's written in Chamorro or metadata's in Tokpasin, we will present that and highlight that. And I think as part of this, we have traditional knowledge label fields built into the schema. Currently, none of our content partners are utilizing those fields, but they're there for if and when anyone does. And I'd just like to acknowledge the work of Jane Anderson and Maui Hudson from the TK Labels group and their support as we've worked through this. I think importantly and quite philosophically for me, we never take metadata. In the event of our pilot project being closed down, content partners lose nothing because they always hold their own metadata. And in terms of the Pacific-wide experience of colonialism and the legacy of taking of items, this was really crucial to me. Digital colonization is already taking place, and we couldn't be a space that enabled that. I'd like to finish my points with a little bit of a description of the island of Tuvalu, which is one of our locations. So you may not be aware of Tuvalu the nation or its people, but you've probably, if you've used Twitch, Fora or Ustream, you've used their domain name, which is of course .tv. The land area of the 9 islands, which you can see on the screen here, totals 26 square kilometers, which is about 10 square miles. And the average height above sea level of these 9 islands is 1 meter. I think the highest point of land in Tuvalu is about 4 meters. Whilst it's only 24 square kilometers, the exclusive economic zone of Tuvalu covers an oceanic area of approximately 900,000 square kilometers. And for reference, the land area of Texas is about 695,000 kilometers squared. So in this case, you can technically say Tuvalu is bigger than Texas. Tuvalu has a population of approximately 11,000 people. And just to give you some reference here, Tuvalu, and this is using the website TrueSize, this is Tuvalu against the eastern seaboard. It's quite hard to see. Funafuti, which I've pointed out on the previous slide, which is the capital, is here, approximately just south of Philadelphia. Baltimore, this is the most southernmost island. So I apologize, I don't know all the names of the islands, but it stretches as a nation all the way to Boston. There's a couple more little tiny pink dots just underneath the O of Connecticut, which are also all of these parts of Tuvalu. And I think it's, as you consider that scale, as we overlay this section United States and also Tuvalu, I'd like you to consider that the digital connectivity for these 11,000 people is all via satellite currently. Current network speeds are about 1.5 megabytes down and 500 kilobytes up. And whilst there are plans to bring submarine cable and fiber access to the country, that hasn't occurred yet. This photo on the right is the Tuvalu National Library and Archives, and we've had the privilege of meeting and chatting with their staff and presenting a webinar with them actually about 10 days ago, which was a really fantastic experience in terms of making their work visible and accessible. They actually hold in that building there, which, as we saw in our webinar, is leaking and has holes in the side of it. They hold paper records dating back to the 1800s. And I think there's something really powerful about just that little piece of narrative, because actually each of these institutions that are on the screens now hold records, objects and images of Tuvalu. And I've found those by literally doing a manual search for these institutions, going to their websites and typing in Tuvalu. There's nothing sophisticated about their presence there. But if our site can leverage those digitized records on those and probably dozens of other institutions, that's a really powerful thing. I'd like to just finish with this comment and then hand to Leonie. The Pacific Ocean in this view here shows it. The Pacific Ocean covers 33% of the surface area of this planet. But most of our default mental models of users and designing digitally are based on land-based experiences. And therefore, the Pacific Island locations, their cultures and people are mostly invisible to us. Or alternatively, they're seen as singular, remote, exotic, idyllic locations. But they are neither invisible, nor should they be romanticized. Each of these locations and the people that are from these cultures are unique, vibrant, living, and enduring. And in the face of overwhelming legacies and hugely complex challenges in the next coming few decades. They were and are, as my colleague Dr. Teresi Bonadillo said to me yesterday, pre-contact with the West, astronomers, food scientists, mathematicians, sailors, artists, and navigators, all in our own right, all in our own ways. And it's very easy to forget that, I think. Another good friend of ours, the former head of the National Archives of Fiji, Opeta Aliafaio, he spoke of the site and said, it's one thing for Pacific people to know that they had their culture taken from them. It's another thing entirely to not know that the artifacts and records of their culture still exist. If our project has done a small thing to start to bridge that gap in knowledge and awareness, then I think we've done a very worthy thing. Vinaka Vakalevasara, thank you for listening. I will now hand over to Leonie.
Okay, hello everybody. Greetings from the biggest continent in the world. The focus question that I set for myself for this part of the presentation was where and what am I coming from that informs my participation in Digital Pacific. So from a personal position, I'm a millennial. I'm a New Zealand-born Samoan woman with Māori heritage, and sort of in this is my key strength and cultural capital that I draw on in my working life at Auckland Museum. And for me, my starting point in everything is my extended family, my ainga, and the cultural framework that I've been brought up in. So it's important for me to know who I come from, know ways to show my respect, to know how I observe cultural protocols and how I apply these appropriately when new situations arise. So I've grown up in a worldview of being aware of relational space and feeling love for my family and connection to my genealogy through activating that cultural, that relational space. And more of that practice of maintaining those relationships is being done online. And of late in the global pandemic, it's basically all been online. Next slide, please, Tim. Okay, so my engagement with Digital Pacific is shaped by seminal writings of the last few decades about Oceania as a region. So going back to this picture that Tim had, it's long been in other people's interests to see this part of the world as a big blue blank space. There's been imperialistic advantages to writing off the islands as tiny and remote so as to better exploit resources and narrow frames of mind. It was a celebrated writer and academic, Epeli Hauofa, back in the 90s who argued for rejecting deficit narratives like this, and for us as Pacific people to instead see this whole Oceania region as a connected sea of islands, diverse sea of islands. This is because there's always been movement, there's always been trade and cultural relationships, pre-contact, post, and even now in the digital sphere. Peoples of Oceania, though widely dispersed physically and even more so with diaspora communities in settler states like the US, Australia, and New Zealand, those relational ties between those people and their homelands are still nurtured on a daily basis. This practice of maintaining relationships and practicing culture and embarking on forming new cultural identities on the daily is made easier by the internet, and in the digital environment, those physical distances collapse, new connections can be made. And Lana Lopesi is one writer who's written about the potential of the internet to fast track Pacific peoples from across these expanses and from these colonial legacies to find and connect with each other again. Slide 3, please, Tim. So here is a visioning of the Pacific that I like in comparison to the other. This is a map by a cartographer named David Garcia, revealing the connections of the landscape. So underneath the water, these landforms of the Pacific are still connected to each other, run deep and run just across. This is, it's intentionally this orientation. And yeah, I love it because it says everything to what Epili Hau'ofa and others have talked about when we re-envision the Pacific. Next slide, please. Okay, so as for the museum work-related aspect of participating in Digital Pacific, I'm representing Tamaki Paingahira, Auckland Memorial Museum, and that's located in central Auckland in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Auckland Museum is a primary content partner in Digital Pacific. So having Auckland Museum's Pacific-related content in the Digital Pacific platform reflects our museum's strategic intent to open up greater access digitally to collections for communities that we serve. Auckland is informally is known as the world's biggest Polynesian city. There are several strongholds of Pacific communities who have settled here from the islands in several waves. From the 1950s onwards, it's what is most known. Samoa, Tonga, Fiji, Cook Islands, Niue, Tokelau, Tuvalu, and more recently Kiribati. The ties between these communities here in my city of Auckland and the island homelands still very strong. Although in recent years, there's been concerns around how to foster cultural identity and well-being among the young people who are born in New Zealand and how they can maintain links to their culture, language, and identity with those homelands. Over recent years, there's been significant investment in digitization and digital access in natural sciences, social history, the Māori collections, documentary heritage. And it's this project, Pacific Collection Access Project, that was sort of part of that big work to get more content, more collections online. What differentiates this particular line of work from the other projects that happened at Auckland Museum was the priority on community engagement that that happens with this particular project here. This community-led engagement was a first on the scale for our museum to commit to, with some really beautiful outcomes, but also some very steep learnings for the institution, as well as some failures too, it has to be said. It was a formative experience personally, and I learned a lot about what it really meant and what it really took to attempt to foster relationships at both the personal and at institutional level. What you see in the picture here are various community events that happened all the way through that 3-year period, as well as with this slide, which I'll go into, knowledge holder sessions. So Auckland Museum's ethnographic Pacific collections is world-class. It's numbered at about 30,000 treasures. This number would increase by several thousand more if you took into account the Pacific documentary heritage collections, photographs, archives that I care for now in my area. Throughout the 3-year period of PCAP activity, there are about 6,000 Pacific treasured objects that passed through the rehousing, conservation, cataloging, and photography process. The metadata sets that is hosted on the Digital Pacific platform is a legacy from PCAP. I was a cataloger on that project, on the PCAP project. So a crucial part of the project was holding these sessions with respected elders and recognized knowledge holders to help us with our documentation. Like many museums where Indigenous collections have skeletal records, our documentation was spotty and clinical before these sessions with knowledge holders, before they gifted terms, concepts, identifications, and advice on storage and care, especially of very sacred items that we had. The nature of PCAP's metadata and how it was gathered makes me cringe to say the word metadata because the word itself is so impersonal and clinical. Indigenous knowledge was imparted to us catalogers with the intention of better digital access to collections, making Indigenous terms searchable and making it easier for those who are experiencing this physical distance from these treasures to still have digital access. we had our own internal processes around caring and transmission of knowledge, and definitely times where we didn't record sessions, or when we were asked to pause and just hear something off the record. Yeah, fine, that's fine. But I still think of these enriched records, this metadata now, as extensions on those relationships and that trust. I am accountable to those who shared with me. I'm accountable to treat that knowledge with respect, to honor their contributions and not cause them regret at any point for sharing with us. Next slide. Yeah, so I'm coming from a need to indigenize concepts related to digital practice, so that a sense of that accountability and honoring get carried over into the digital space. So it's not, so the digital space is not like a wild, wild west for those old colonial attitudes to then get a foothold in. Tim talked about the agile methodology that went into making Digital Pacific. And I would also say that an Indigenous methodology we've been pursuing at Auckland Museum in our museum practice in recent years has also been activated in this project. I couldn't work any other way. So that's always been the source of any questions I had for Tim or the other people on the team, shaping and forming this project. The Indigenous Samoan concept that I keep at the center of my own practice is this notion of te uleva. In English, that's a maxim to nurture and tend to relationships. Relationality is so integral to Pacific ways of being and doing and knowing. I was excited a couple of weeks ago to come across this model presented by Native American academics that you see on the right hand of the screen. I found it on TikTok, of all places, but it sets up the logic perfectly. So in my mind, this concept of va that's Indigenous to the Pacific, it's right there in the middle, that relationality holism section of that model. So at Auckland Museum, te uleva museum practice during PCAP was expressed in things like hosting communities properly with food, open access to connect with the collections, proper welcoming ceremony, proper numeration for our knowledge holders on par with consultants who work at the museum, permissions for digitized images of collections, and proper protocols, especially for sacred objects. Recognizing that knowledge is embodied in the treasures of the collections, and committing to making sure that communities continue to have that access to what is essentially theirs in the first place. That's what's currently driving our practice even now, 2 years after the project finished. Our museum is changing, and it's a good change because of what we went through in that project. And so this is, next slide, please, Tim. All these things I bring with me into participating and being active in this Digital Pacific project. Really great part of, or a really key part of thinking relationally, or in terms of relationships. Relationships can be nurtured, or they can also be sullied or broken or need mending. And a key part of relationship building is this talanoa aspect of speaking critically and speaking with care, and discussing these bigger issues at play. And that's, yeah, there are bigger issues at play in this Digital Pacific project. That was me coming into it, was just like, okay, these are things that need more thinking through and understanding the realities of, I think. So what Tim said at the beginning, that this is a project that's funded by a government agency, and not even New Zealand's, it's Australia's Foreign Affairs Department. That funding has its own strings attached, as I soon realized, and a lot of it is to do, there's a lot of geopolitics in there as well. So for an example, understanding that with this DFAT funding comes this is where I think I need you, Tim, as well. Understanding that there are places in the Pacific that are still politically contested at the moment that seep into how we frame our website, if that makes sense. So for instance, Australia, the island, Norfolk Island, is considered a territory that Australia administers. Therefore, is not at the surface of our Digital Pacific platform. Another example similar is the Torres Strait Islands are considered a territory that Australia takes care of. So again, they're not at the front of our, you can still search for those items on this website platform, but they're not listed at the front as these other island places are. There's no New Zealand on the website, even though, you know, Māori are Polynesian. And that's another political thing in terms of DFAT is intending for this project to reach Pacific people under you know, aid, this idea of aid. So that's good for
developing nations.
Aid in developing nations. Okay. And if you were to look up West Papua, which is a politically contested space in the Pacific, you would find items from collections, but again, that is not on the front of the there's not front of page on this platform. Again, these geopolitics that come with the funding has been an interesting reality to understand and deal with. The second point, we're in a global pandemic. Trying to co-design or make a platform for Pacific people when you can't get to those islands, everyone is in lockdown, and for people's own safety, we can't get and connect with people in person, has been another reality as well. One thing that Tim hadn't mentioned really quickly, and I don't know what my time is now, but Tim hadn't mentioned
about 10 minutes.
Okay. Tim hadn't mentioned that there's a user contribution feature on this platform, and I thought that was really special and interesting to be used as a way for Pacific people from wherever they are to respond to our content partners' content with their own knowledge or their own corrections. So someone can search the site and before they...
Sorry, Leonie, I'll drop into the chat, I'll drop the 2 blogs that explain it. So it might give you some of the context as well as the functionality. Yeah. And
I thought that was one interesting way of being able to have Pacific people speak back or speak to with knowledge that runs complementary, parallel to what the institution has. Because again, skeletal metadata has been a really interesting other reality of this project. I'm going to stop there because I'd like to get into Talanoa and maybe talk a little bit more about them. But despite these realities and these things to consider, again, my default is going back to relationship building and relationality. There are workarounds, I believe, and this my optimism and my hope in these workarounds is how I believe that, yeah, just that we can, what is it, Tim? I've lost my train of thought, but just relationship building comes down to that. And I think that's why I still participate in forming and feeding back into this project, because there's just so much potential for this platform to connect people together. I think that's where I want to end it.
Oh, kia ora, thank you, Leonie. Yeah, I think to sum up what Leonie said in that last part, it is a fascinating path we've had to lead in terms of threading this needle between all the different factors that balance around it, in terms of the great game of geopolitics and the great game of who owns what and who calls what, given that the cultural heritage and the archival institutions we have hold records that well predate our current layers of geopolitics, and culture, arguably, as Leonie has pointed out, in terms of connecting people across the blue continent, predate any of our politics and the great labels that we use now, and not just the labels, but how we fund this sort of work. Happy in the way of Talanoa to jump forward. I'll leave that up there for review. But did anyone have any, and thank you, Carolyn, we've just got 5 minutes left. Did anyone want to ask a question, or either in the text or just verbally? We can unmute you. I might even stop shall I stop the screen share? And we'll bring people in. So if you wanted to ask us anything or just general commentary. Kia ora, Max. Do I have to unmute you, or you're good to? Oh yeah, sweet.
Amazing site, and thank you for just talking about for presenting this. I mean, it's I can see how there's trying to do this with in the context of the global pandemic, trying to do this in the context of all these political things is but still being there for it is, I commend you for that. It's pretty amazing work. So
thank you. And I did mention in the chat, DPLA, we're currently working through harvesting from their content, which is all CC0. So we're really excited by that. Even just bluntly searching for Oceania, Polynesia, Micronesia, and Melanesia, we're estimating gets us about 50,000 records out of that corpus. And that's an amazing thing for people of the Pacific who don't know that, or probably don't know that DPLA exists in the first instance, but don't know that all the many content partners behind it exist as well. So yeah, we're excited by doing that. Yeah, any other thoughts? I suppose my ask is if any of your museums or institutions that hold Pacific records would love to chat one-on-one and be able to share and show your work, and happy to meet outside this or in Slack and go forward, because we'd love to highlight more work that you're doing and that you hold as well. Yeah, thank you, Marie. Yeah, the philosophy behind it's been an evolving thing. We met yesterday with our DFAT sponsors, and actually, I mean, he's been really fantastic support. But there's a really interesting piece around what DFAT probably set out and thought this would be, and what it now is. And I think he's definitely in the space where he's seen the process by which we've walked and how we've walked it, and is absolutely backing it for further funding. As I said at the start, it's a pilot, and at this point our funding runs out in February, March, or finishes in February, March as a contract. And so we're currently in the process of going through what that looks like to apply for another, potentially, well, we're pitching for 3 years of funding to continue to develop it and have it work. And at that point, hopefully post-pandemic a bit more and a bit more travel, we can finally get to some of these islands and meet some of these people and have those conversations too. Oh, good. Thank you. I think Carolyn's in behind the screen there. I think we're kind of all wrapped up. That was everything we had to say, and thank you for your comments and questions. Again, really appreciate. Thank you for joining us late in your evenings or early in your evenings, yeah, look forward to the rest of the conference. Both of us are in the Slack channel, so if you wanted to ask us any questions after, I think our details are on the profile in the shared site and all. So yeah, thank you for joining us, and take care.